Welcome to Tools for Liberty, a video from Dalton Church of the Nazarene. I'm Pastor Amanda, and this is Pastor Dylan.
All right, this is episode 5. We're going to be discussing the issue of the homeless and really everything that goes around with that today. And let's go ahead and get into our terms. The first term I want to discuss today is one that you may or may not have heard. It's a very ugly word if you've ever seen it written down, but it's the word obfuscate. And it means something very particular, and I think it's a very critical word to use when discussing this, because it's this word that means to render something obscure, to render it obsolete, or to render it irrelevant. Now, it is a verb, but this word, if you say you're obfuscating something, that means you're blurring the lines between things, but it means you're intentionally saying that it's irrelevant to articulate the differences between something. For instance, if we were to come in here and we were to have sort of these microphones we have before us now, and then we had some older microphones that were not condenser microphones. And for instance, the video camera we have in front of us, it has a microphone on it now. If I were to obfuscate the difference between the two microphones, I could say that it doesn't matter which microphone we use, but in reality, one of them has a much better sound quality than the other. And it actually is relevant to notice that there's a difference between the two microphones. When you obfuscate something, you are saying it's irrelevant, it's obscure, it's obsolete to articulate the differences between different things. And it's an important word that will come up in our discussion today.
And so as he mentioned, we are talking about the homeless issue. And so we do want to make our wording very clear as we go through this conversation so we can have an honest and articulate conversation. And so one of the terms we're going to use is the circumstantially unfortunate. And how we're defining that here is that through circumstances outside of an individual's control, a person has lost their home and other resources. And so this is going to go on, and later we're going to talk about the spectrum that this lies on then with another term.
All right, and the other end of that spectrum is the voluntary vagrant. Now this means something very particular, and sort of the operative thing of this is being resistant to transformation and change. But we're defining voluntary vagrant as one whose residency is a territory and not a specific address, and they are someone who is resistant to change, resistant to transformation.
And so as we said, this topic is going to discuss, and it's going to lie on a spectrum. So oftentimes when we get into the conversation of people who are homeless and other circumstances and situations around the homeless issue, we may be having a conversation, but we're not using the same terms, or we don't define them same way. And so it's hard to have an honest conversation. And so when we use these two terms that we have just defined, we're using them on a spectrum. And so there are people who find themselves in a situation that they did not plan for, they did not mean to be in, and maybe they don't possess the skills to get out of that circumstance, or like we said, their resources are gone, so they can't just kind of pick up and go to another home. Something has happened. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you do have where people are, maybe they got into that circumstance outside their control, maybe they made choices that put them in that situation, but they have now been in the situation and they've decided that they don't want there to be change. They don't want to do whatever needs to be done to move forward with their lives. And so again, it is a spectrum. So there's not someone completely on one side or the other, or there may be. And also as people can change, they can find themselves where they're circumstantially unfortunate, but they move to a place where they want to be their willing vagrant, or they may be a willing vagrant and then they move to, or a voluntary vagrant, and they've moved to a place where they're like, now I need to get out of this, but currently I'm still in this bad situation, but I do want to move forward. So keep that in mind as we continue this conversation.
And one of the purposes we have for this is because it's important to have critical thinking. That's why we're having this conversation today. A lot of people, when they come to this topic of homelessness, they'll try to paint you as a villain if you question any orthodoxy. It's one of those sort of words in our culture where they say, well, we're helping the homeless, and then that's there. However, you're not a villain if you use critical thinking when dealing with people who are often described under the umbrella term of homeless. You're not. If somebody says you're hateful for not dealing with the homeless, you're not hateful unless you have a hateful motive or malice intent behind what you're doing. It is very reasonable to take critical thinking to this, because there's really two very distinct ends of a spectrum which are used under this umbrella term. And I think it's a little bit either intellectually dishonest or intellectually deficient to obfuscate this issue, to pretend that, and this is why we use the word obfuscate, it is not an obsolete thing to point out that some people are resistant to change and other people are circumstantially unfortunate but still want change in their life. They want to move out of that. So you're not a villain if you point out that some of these people are resistant to change. They just want to take advantage of the things that are there. They don't want to better their lives. Even their own decision-making things are not the best decisions for their circumstances. And other people who have been very, very wonderful people who contribute to society. They've gotten an unfortunate circumstance, and they do want change. You're not a villain for pointing out that this is an umbrella term for very different ends of a spectrum. It is not a bad thing to say, I don't want to obfuscate these ends of the spectrum. I want to be somebody who thinks critically about this issue. As the church, who is called to do compassionate ministry, we're called to be a people of love. Again, in our last video, we just defined love as being the ability to bless in complex situations. This is a complex situation, and we need to have critical thinking when coming to the situation. And you're not a villain if you simply just want to use critical thinking when dealing with this issue.
And then go off what you're saying. Love is creating opportunities. It is blessing, is creating opportunity for life in complex situations. And so in loving, oftentimes, again, echoing something we had mentioned in our last video, is love does not allow people to remain in bad behavior or bad circumstances. We're not enabling people to remain where they are. And so, again, love creates opportunity. It can't force people to change, but it creates opportunity for them to better themselves. So oftentimes, especially when people are trying to say, how do I help the homeless around me or the unfortunate around me? How do I do this in a way that is loving and compassionate, but also promotes and encourages them to do better and is not enabling bad behavior? Is that we have to, as a church specifically, often we deal with guilt. And so there's something that we have to then tell ourselves. We don't have to feel guilty for allowing or promoting people to do better. And if people resist change, we shouldn't feel guilty for that. And it's discouraging, it's disheartening, but we are responsible for our actions, and we are responsible to help other people, but they are responsible for their response.
Yeah, so we don't need to feel guilty if we're not enabling bad behavior. You shouldn't. As much as Christ was a one whose behavior was featured by or defined by love, he was also the Logos. He also went out and said there must be transformation, there must be change. And while Christ was willing to help anyone who was going to receive it, Christ did not help people do bad things. He didn't say, well, I have this fact that I am God incarnate. I'm not going to help people go, rob a bank. I'm not going to help people go commit a murder and deal with all the logistic things of that. He helped people towards orderly transformation, having a better life. So if people come and they say, well, if you're a Christian, you're supposed to be helping me, don't let people guilt you into doing things that are not correct. Don't feel guilty into enabling bad behavior. We must have the Logos. We must, instead of being guilted into doing bad behavior, we must instead point people towards transformation. We must point people towards something which is more orderly, that's away from chaos, away from suffering, away from misery. And again, we really don't have infinite resources, but how do we deal with that?
So, yeah, it's like you said, so we do have limited resources. We have limited money. We have limited time. We have limited skills and intellect. And so there's kind of a finite way in which we can help people. And so we have to think then critically of how we get what resources we do have to the people in need. Also in this conversation, oftentimes when we speak of the homeless problem, or something I have noticed a lot, it has to do with kind of how we then address politics and other social issues, is we kind of do this for or against, and we're not willing to have a real conversation of, okay, I'm for it, I'm for helping people, but maybe not the way you're saying, and that doesn't make me against helping people. And so we often talk about these things kind of in their own little bubble, in a void, and we don't realize that it's a very complex issue. People are complex, and so we have to kind of address, okay, there's our culture's view on healthcare, our culture's view on mental health. There's things like we have a culture, I think, that does kind of lean more towards enabling people than calling them towards transformation. Often we are a culture that thinks very short term. So I have this want, and I know how to get that want right now. And we don't think, well, if I use my finite resources to help this need or this want right now, then I'm not going to have the resources later on that is for something I actually need. And that could be the people who are the voluntary vagrants, or the people that are circumstantially unfortunate, or it could be the people trying to help them. And I think that's something we have to address, is like, okay, as a person, I'm not homeless and I want to help the people around me, is, all right, I could do something right now, and maybe that might appease my guilt, or it may help them for an instant, but I've not given them the resources or the structure to really move forward in their lives. And so we do have to address all these issues if we're going to have a meaningful conversation that's going to not just kind of, we're going to say this, feel good because we've talked about it and move on, but we're going to actually, this is going to lead to action that is meaningful and long-term.
And this is not something we had planned on talking about, but just building a little bit off of what you said. Not everybody who creates programs that are enabling are people with bad intent. You know, I've come to as an individual and as a minister, I come to realize I'm not going to attribute anything to malice that I can first attribute to some sort of deficiency. People are, again, more complex than they are self-aware. And the spectrum of human behavior, just like there's a spectrum of people under the broad umbrella term homelessness, you know, sometimes people do things, they're more orderly than they are creative, and they just do things which are the sort of established way of dealing with people. Maybe there's a whole number of reasons why people will go along with programs and not question it. Maybe they've just never thought to. They've never brought critical thinking to the table. And there are a lot of people who do these programs, which I think really, by the end of the day, they are enabling. They're not helping people. They're not transforming people. But they're not necessarily villains, though I think there are people who may be villains. There's certainly people who have malicious intent with this, but I think there are also people who have their heart in the right place, or maybe their heart is in a rather neutral place. It could be all sorts of the spectrum. It's not necessarily a thing of malice, though malice is unmistakably out there, which is so important while we don't obfuscate the different things which are going on. It's important to come to the table with critical thinking as we develop compassionate ministries, as we go out to do services which are compassionate to help people. It's so important that we just bring critical thinking there, don't you think? Critical thinking is important?
Yeah.
Well, one other thing I want to bring up is a lot of times we don't really understand the degree of which people exist in these conditions. So one of the things I would like to encourage you, if you're listening to this, go out and do some homework. Go and research how much people can make begging and panhandling, because it's a spectrum in and of itself, which is completely fascinating. And if you can find any academic journals on this, there's a lot out there who have done real research into this. And I know not everybody has access to academic journals, but just try to look for some scholarly work on this, or look for some credible articles. And later today, we're going to talk about clickbait journalism. But one thing I wanted to bring up is that a lot of times people can bring in obscene amounts of money doing panhandling, and we sometimes don't realize this. One of the things that was found at Coos Bay in Oregon, their police department went out and found that there were people who were making around $300 a day just in a single Walmart parking lot. People were doing this. And the numbers that the panhandlers were self-reporting were much lower than that. And we've seen this in several studies across the country. They've sent people out who, to varying degrees, they've made themselves appear as sort of panhandlers, and people have made anything from $10 an hour to over $300 an hour. Notice how earlier I was talking about $300 a day. There are people who've been able to make hundreds of dollars an hour doing this in these studies where they've done this. And all of this is tax-free money, and people can make anything from $20,000 a year to upwards of close to $80,000 to $100,000 a year. And we have studies all across the United States where they've done this, as well as in Canada and the UK. And people going out and doing this, they're able to access resources even though they don't have the ability to necessarily use them well. So it's one of those things where we are giving resources which is enabling these poor behaviors, and we have to ask the question, are we bringing transformation to people in this situation? A lot of times people feel guilty when they see this. Amanda mentioned this earlier. Don't let them make you feel guilty when they come up to you, because a lot of times these situations where people come up to you are more complex than what we may realize.
Right. And to go off what you were saying is that when you sometimes when we hear these stories of the person making $300 an hour, we're like, wow, I'm totally in the wrong field. I need to, obviously, my job doesn't pay $300 an hour. And so we can often paint these people as villains or malicious intent. Mm-hmm. And I think for most of them, and I wouldn't say all, because I don't know, there could be people who are trying to scam others, but I think most of them, it's not a matter of being malicious or trying to steal your money or scam you, but it really is that they do not have the skills or the ability to use those resources wisely. So even if they get that $300, then it's spent or it's used, or it may not be money, it may even be some kind of resource that helps them with temporary housing or a job, but because they lack the skills to order their life properly, that money is gone as soon as it's gotten. And so we have to, I think, like you said, it's a complex issue. And so as we were talking about and planning for this conversation, I had shared a story of I was in the Kroger parking lot, and the Kroger had a gas station on the other end of the parking lot, and a gentleman came up to me. He said that he was in need. He didn't have any money on him, but he needed gas so he could get back home. And so I said, okay, meet me at the gas station. I'll fill up your car, or at least get you, fill your tank halfway, or just whatever I can do. He said, okay. So I meet him over at the gas station, and he pulls up in a much nicer car than even I own. And I realized I don't believe that man was lying to me. I think he really did need money for gas. He really didn't need gas in his car. But something had happened in his life where he had ordered things differently, and so now he was able at one point to afford a very nice car, but now found himself in need. And so I think that's kind of an example of just as we talk about the spectrum of people who are in need, is that we have to, sometimes we can't do the easy thing for us, or kind of the thing that would make us feel better, but we have to say, okay, let's be in conversation, let's build a relationship where we can actually get you where you need to go, and not just fulfill kind of an immediate want, but how can we get you back into a structure and a system that will promote, that's a blessing, that is life-giving.
All right, so one of the things that I really want to also emphasize is that we can go out, we can verify this, we can reliably rediscover it, and we can reliably verify it multiple times. One of the things that's consistent about people who would go out and do this sort of things is that they are resistant to change. This is one of the things we brought up earlier. You need to have a policy in your life, and you have things thought out how you will respond to people, because it is okay. You're not a villain if you use critical thinking and say, I'm not going to obfuscate the ends of the spectrum. Some people are resistant to change. Some people are not. Maybe it's something that's their fault. Maybe they've made bad decisions. Maybe they have a mental health problem. Maybe things beyond their control has got them there. Now they're comfortable to it. There's a lot of things that people are conscious of, things that people are not conscious of, things that they're personally guilty of, things that they're not. But the end of the spectrum, where people have become voluntary vagrants, it's reliably consistent that they are resistant to change, they're resistant to transformation. And as the church, while we're called to love people, we're also called to be people of transformation. So you need to have a policy in your life. Think out a statement of how you respond to people where you say, look, I love you and I care about you and I want to help you order your life better, but I can't enable you to do bad behavior. You have to give me something back in return, showing me that you're not going to do things in bad behavior. Don't let people guilt you into enabling bad behavior. We have to remember, and we have to have a good theology that says Christ was love and Christ was also the Logos.
And so I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but about us building those relationships. And so as we've looked kind of across our community in various places, it really seems the ministries that are focused on the individual, the ministries that are not treating people kind of in a mass herd, the ones that are really getting to know people and saying, what is your specific circumstance? Where are you on the spectrum? Where do you want to go? And again, we've talked in other videos about having a goal. And is the goal righteousness? Is it being back in right relatedness, right order with the rest of the world? And so those ministries that really focus on people seem to be helping and working better. And so as yourself as an individual, and then if you go to church or you are working within a community or an organization, is okay, how can I help people? It really is seeing that these are individuals with complex lives. We can't just slap the label homeless on them and walk away. But really, where are you? Where do you want to go? And how can we help you get there? So
that's that. If you have any questions or comments on the topic of really understanding the term homelessness, I myself try to avoid using the word homeless to describe people. I think it's a word that obfuscates different realities. I think it's a word that can be dishonest and manipulative. But let's get into a current issue. If you have any questions or comments on that, please hit us up in the comment section. Please either message one of us. We're fairly accessible people. But let's get to a current issue. Amanda, what's something that's been on your mind lately? Okay,
so we were talking about all these different issues and what our conversation today was, and I had mentioned about clickbait. We've talked about kind of chaos bait, but really clickbait's everywhere, and it's not just in like our little Facebook feed with weird little statements, but in our journalism and how we receive news and how we understand the world around us and how it's working. It's this attraction to kind of, instead of the headline helping us get to the article, it really is just like the article's just filler for whatever we wanted on the headline. And it's like we can base our whole information gathering system on just these kind of, not even whole sentences, a half sentence headline, to where it's like, okay, I know what's going on in the world because I read 2 headlines and this is the villain, this is, the person that's going to help us, and all is settled.
Yeah, and something you mentioned earlier is we usually have an A or B set up culturally. This is rarely the case in life. Usually things are much more complex than that. I know we're using the word complex a lot, but really things in life are, which is why having critical thinking is so important. I look at a lot of this. There is so much clickbait journalism, and it seems like a lot of the media in our country is oriented towards that. And it's like the only reason why they even have an article after that is because that's the traditional structure that's there, and they have to justify a headline with an article where really what they're just trying to do is throw out a headline, and that's what they want you to get. You're not a villain if you use critical thinking. Maybe you come to this and you're like, I read that, but I didn't get anything out of it. You're probably not somebody who lacks comprehension skills. You're probably just someone who just read an article that had nothing that required comprehension. There was just nothing to it. It was just completely hollow. So it's okay to be people who want comprehension. The name of this program is Tools for Liberty. We want to inspire you to go out and read, do research. That is getting increasingly hard to do, as with the clickbait journalism that's out there. You want to find something meaningful, and that can be difficult to do. Any last thoughts on all of that?
No, I think we're good.
Yes, please do share the videos. That really helps with the viewership. There's a lot of importance in having critical thinking in the church, and we want to really advertise critical thinking, and we want to encourage people to do that. And if you will help us in advertising for Tools for Liberty, that will be fantastic. And I hope you have a great day.